Good morning. My name is Jim Neal. I'm the University Librarian at Columbia, and I had the privilege of working with Frank for over 12 years to be his colleague and his friend. It is my honor to welcome you to this symposium, this celebration of Frank's wisdom, Frank's work, his accomplishment, and his influence. Frank was a true intellectual. The life of the mind was so important for him, but he also recognized the importance of translating ideas into action as educator, author, mentor, technologist, and administrator. The filters for his genius were communication and media, from the Roman funerals of his Ph.D. dissertation to the most innovative learning systems of the future. Welcome. This is a great event to honor Frank's important work and his legacy to all of us. I turn the program over to Robbie McClintock, who will introduce us to Frank and launch the symposium. Robbie.
Good morning. It's an honor to be able to praise Frank today, and a very sad occasion to have to do it. Frank was born in 1943. He lived his youth across the river in West New York, went to St. Bonaventure's and studied classics, came back to New York in the classics department at Columbia and earned an MA. And then he showed up one day in my office. I was a brand new assistant professor of the history of education. And he walked in and said, I hear you like Heraclitus. I had no idea how he knew that, but Heraclitus was one of the favorite figures of in my intellectual life. And from that instant on, Frank was an important presence in my experience. He was a born teacher. Right out of college, he started teaching at St. Peter's Prep in Jersey City, and then a series of positions in Bloomfield College, Barnard, NYU, Columbia Teachers College, the Dalton School, and finally the Center for New Media Teaching and Learning at Columbia, which some would describe as a technology group, but for Frank it was very much an educational enterprise, deeply entwined with the educational life of all of Columbia University, every school and department. And Frank brought to that, I think, one of the most creative curricular development mentalities that I've ever come in contact with. I want to introduce today's proceedings by speaking a little bit about the dissertation that Jim mentioned on Augustus and Virgil and the Pedagogy of Power, which I think tells us a lot about the characteristic mode of educational work, what Frank understood as the grounds of a education that will stick with people. Frank had, as I've talked in recent weeks with a number of others who've been close to him, Frank combined a sense of the importance of organizations, of structures in the historical process of life. He was a radical, but he was not one who wished to tear down the organizations that give form to our experience. Yet at the same time, he was unpredictable in a good sense, in that he would act not simply by what he thought the constraints of the situation dictated, but what he thought he as a person should try to achieve in that situation where constraints were at work. He wanted to put his mark on situations in a way that I think over and over again reincarnated what Hannah Arendt speaks about in The Human Condition as the natality of action, the ability to make it originate something in the midst of what others will see as predictabilities. And I think in interesting ways that set of qualities comes from Frank's involvement in the classics and his engagement with both Augustus and Virgil in his dissertation, which he started to write in 1973 and worked on it very persistently while doing many other things as well, and finally defended in 1983. The sense that he had of that dissertation, I think, pervaded his later work. It began with a section, a quite original section, on the pedagogy of Roman funerals, particularly Roman public funerals, that the families of elites in the Republican period, and finally Augustus in his bringing everything together in Frank's mind, in the establishment of the Roman Empire as a imperial entity. Frank was interested in the political education that was going on in that process. And he was deeply interested in the idea of pietas, which was a sense of respect, a recognition of what one's predecessors had accomplished. And he saw Virgil's Aeneid as an epic poem in praise of pietas. And he saw Augustus as a deep political thinker, aware that it was important to revise the idea of pietas, not to do away with it, suppress it, but to mobilize it in a certain, somewhat different way than it had been mobilized in Republican Roman experience. Now, I won't go into all the details of Frank's analysis, but I want to stress as a prelude to our looking through Dalton and the Black Rock Forest and CCNMTL at Frank's characteristic pedagogical work. I want to point out certain features of what Frank thought was particularly important in Virgil's sense of how to mobilize pietas within a tradition in which the funeral for elite families was a central educational experience. In Republican Rome, every major family had its imagenes, its representations of the figures in its family, in the family, and they were aspects of the decoration of a major household. One saw them, a youth would see them daily with a representation, of a kind of caption of who each figure was. And when someone died, particularly the paterfamilias died, the imagines would be taken out from off the wall and their niches in the wall, and taken in a parade that would go through a funeral cortege that would go through the city of Rome, and the whole city would be a witness to it. And each figure would be someone who the people witnessing it could say, this was that person, that was another person. And the record of their achievements in this way was rehearsed within the community. And in Frank's view, this was and I think realistically so, a very powerful formative experience for those who were in the cortege and those who were witnessing it. And the very heart of Virgil's Aeneid in Book 6 is a poetic presentation of a funeral procession that Aeneas, in going into the underworld and meeting his father, is shown by his father, representing the history of Rome up to Augustus and beyond. Frank thought that this was indicative of a major change that Augustus was trying to bring about in the ideological consciousness of Romans, bringing multiple Republican families that were always contending with each other together in one large state family that became the familial center of the Roman Empire thereafter. What fascinated Frank, though, was not simply the scope and, in a sense, audacity of Augustus's effort, which was then reflected iconographically in the Augustan Forum and the Areopagus, but also was transcended, in a sense, in Virgil's poetic power, who presented Aeneas not simply in the Aeneid, not simply as the vehicle for this ideological transformation, but rather as someone who acted independently, who was not acting out a destiny, but through his ability to think on his feet, to make decisions, to make real choices in the succession of events that led him from the defeated Troy to the establishment of a new Rome. He did that not because he was fated to do it, but because he chose in certain ways, in real situations, to do certain things. And in that sense, the Rome that is depicted in creation in the Aeneid is the ongoing creation of individuals acting in real situations, building up a tradition of worth, a tradition of sensibility. Now, in the funeral that would, in a sense, was built this way, you celebrate the worth of your predecessors, and then you must stand up and act on your own behalf in new situations. In that structure, Frank saw a basic pedagogy where over and over and in many different ways, one presents to the coming generation the best and most demanding examples of the past, and then puts them in a situation where they must make some choices of their own that reflect their decision, that reflect their sense of their own self and what they must do. And I think that this is a characteristic of Frank, that he was always appreciative of the example of other people and the elements of our culture, at the same time that he insisted for himself that he act as he thought he should and not as others wished him to do. And I think that that is something that he tried to build into the educational situations that he created for the young. And I hope that you will look at some of the things that you will now see from the group at Dalton, and then the Black Rock Forest, and then CCNMTL, to see how this kernel of pietas for our past and a sense of acting from our own convictions in our present is manifested in his educational work. So I'll turn it over to Gardner Dunnan and my colleagues from the new lab.